So again, my name is Chip Hastie. I've been with Clark Construction for about 17 years. Started my career here in the DC area, moved to the West Coast for about a dozen years, moved back here about a year ago. Actually, I'm splitting time between the DC area and New Orleans right now, working on our VA hospital project. But today I'm here to talk to you about the 32 months that I spent in California between 2011 and 2013 delivering the Long Beach Courthouse. And I'm highlighting that project because it's unique in its delivery method, and I think it speaks to some of the challenges that are coming to the project management discipline. I worked on this project from the proposal phase through occupancy of the facility, and it was delivered using a method called performance-based infrastructure, PBI. PBI is a subset of PPP, or design, build, finance, operate, and maintain. And the nuance with performance-based infrastructure is that the payments to the concessionaire, the contractor, and the operating provider are conditioned upon the performance of the facility. So if it doesn't work, then the state doesn't pay. This is a model that was borrowed from Europe and from Canada. And as I mentioned, I think is a good example of what integrated delivery, a holistic approach over a broader team, by a broader team over a longer term, 35 years in this case, brings more factors into play in the project management process. So just to set the stage, the mission for the project was to replace an existing outmoded 60-year-old courthouse. So I've got a quick video here that speaks to what that facility looked like. So this is circa 2009.
The Long Beach Courthouse is one of the most decrepit court buildings in the state. It was built 50 years ago. Today it is literally falling apart. There is peeling paint everywhere. This is water damage in a file storage area.
This has been ongoing for several years. You have holes in the ceiling and rust and everything.
There is mildew. The air conditioning unit and other machinery are so old they can't even get parts. Some things have been out of order for years, like the alarm on the emergency exit.
It honestly does not work, see?
The security gate where judges park doesn't work so good either. They have a disgusting problem with vermin.
Is that a rat trap?
Yes, it is. As a matter of fact, it is a rat trap.
It's disturbing. There's usually like more than one when they do catch them. It's usually 2 or 3.
In fact, one morning there were 7 rats caught in traps.
The stench is really bad, and I'm the first one in the morning, so I smell.
Chunks of the ceiling come crashing down, so they've roped off seating so that people don't get hurt. There is way too little space. Files are stored literally in every nook and cranny. Retrieval can be a physical challenge. Clerks literally have to crouch down and crawl along this space here in order to get to that file room over there. Every single inch of space is used. Then take a walk past where they're trying to shore up the walls for earthquakes, and you'll come to an old portable that was shoehorned in here about 15 years ago.
This is Department 12. This is where traffic cases are heard.
In fact, 200 to 300 cases a day, with no security screening. Some of the many, many reasons a new court building is long overdue.
And so, I think you get the picture that this is a facility that was not well attended to and really is an example of what can happen and often does when our public infrastructure is subject to kind of appropriations needs and the challenges that are managing budgets in tight times. And the maintenance and upkeep budgets are often the ones that get sacrificed, and maintenance gets deferred, and what we end up with is facilities that look like this. So the AOC, the Administrative Office of the Courts, is the body in the state of California that administers all of the county courthouses. And the AOC's approach was to take a different plan of attack, a different method of delivering new work, using this performance-based infrastructure delivery method. And they started with 11 teams that were interested in pursuing. All 11 of those teams made submissions. The field was narrowed to 5 finalists, and from 5 went to 3. Those 3 went through an intensive process, basically a 6-month evaluation with collaborative dialogue and interactions using the design-build process. From those three, there was ultimately one selected. That was the team that Clark Construction was a part of. And there was about a 6-month period following being identified as the preferred proposer that resulted ultimately in negotiation of the project documents. Financial close was in December 20th of 2010. So as I've described this, there's a lot involved. You're designing, building, financing, operating, and maintaining at risk. And so that takes a little bit different team than might be involved in a traditional pursuit. So I wanted to talk some about that structure, and this speaks to the types of things that as project managers we needed to be thinking about. So at the center of this is Long Beach Judicial Partners. This is a special purpose entity established to deliver the project. They received an equity contribution. The LBJP was set up by Meridian Infrastructure, and they made a 10% equity contribution. The remainder of the financing for the project was all debt. You can see on the right-hand side the banks that were providing financing and debt for the project. You might notice that all of those are non-U.S. banks. At the time of this project, U.S. banks were not feeling particularly hungry for unknown propositions. And this was a delivery method, as I said, that was most prominent in Canada and in Europe, so there were logically Canadian and European and other overseas banks that were involved. Equally importantly, at the bottom of this chart, what you see is the design builder. So that was Clark Construction and AECOM as the design builder, and Johnson Controls as the operating service provider. Clark and Johnson Controls worked together under a coordination agreement that said how we would play in the sandbox together, both during and after the delivery of the project for use. And most of the risks for the project, other than refinancing and some leasing, were carried either by the design builder in the lower left or by the operating service provider in the lower right. All of that ultimately accrued to the state of California as the holder of the contract in the top. Sorry. I've got another video for you here. We'll be done with videos.
It won't be long before this neighborhood in downtown Long Beach will be buzzing with construction activity. The Long Beach Judicial Partners, LLC, has won the competition. They will design, build, finance, operate, and maintain the new courthouse in Los Angeles County. Last year, 3 finalist teams from the private sector unveiled their design and construction proposals. The selection committee then considered the financial and commercial aspects. This consortium was the best in all 5 areas.
It was not an easy choice, but it was a clear winner.
The consortium had outlined its goals.
Achieving functional excellence, achieving design excellence, achieving a piece of civic architecture that Long Beach and the state of California and the Superior Court of Los Angeles will be proud of.
The plan features an L shape, a 5-story wing with 31 courtrooms, and a 4-story office wing, separated by a great hall, a low-rise profile.
That was a conscious decision on the part of the Superior Court in Los Angeles. With this many people, this many courtrooms, it was their considered opinion that they could handle the flow of people, handle the security better in a building that was a little more spread out than a high-rise. And we had the advantage of a 6-acre site.
Which also allows room for the jewel of the plan. All the waiting areas open up toward a 1-acre protected garden courtyard, within court building security, a serenity zone for visitors.
You can sort of calm down a little bit. It's a really terrific idea.
The jury assembly room on the 4th floor of the office wing will also have an outdoor area.
We wanted a special place for the jury, for people that actually come and do their civic duty, so that it's a pleasant area for them to be.
There will be offices for county justice partners to rent and also some retail space. And it'll be built to last for many generations.
Which is quite a challenge, but one we think that is certainly worthy and one that we've embraced.
But what's most remarkable about this project is the partnership between the private sector and the administrative office of the courts, the AOC. It's the first time an arrangement like this has been used for a new court building in this country.
We think it's at the forefront of a new wave of infrastructure delivery.
It's called a performance-based infrastructure project. The private sector consortium will shoulder the investment and the risk of designing, building, financing, operating, and maintaining the courthouse complex. No cost to the state up front, and the AOC owns the complex immediately. The AOC will start making payments after move-in, and then for the next 32 years. It is a cost-effective arrangement for taxpayers.
It's a perfect example about how in difficult economic times we ought to be proceeding with developments. So I'm absolutely delighted.
Long Beach Mayor Bob Foster says he is happy with what's been achieved.
There's a really good cooperative arrangement here between the city, the redevelopment agency, the state of California, and through the Administrative Office of the Courts. And I think it's worked very well. And this is going to be a benefit not only for the courts, it'll wind up being a big benefit for the city of Long Beach.
I'm thrilled that this is being given priority and that we'll move ahead.
In fact, moving ahead at lightning speed.
We're looking forward to this being done in a hurry.
The project should be completed by the fall of 2013. I'm Leanne Kozak reporting for California Courts News.
So I showed you those two videos, one to set the stage for what the existing facility looked like, and then to give you a flavor for the project itself. But I want to focus on what the delivery method involved with performance-based infrastructure. And what we're looking at here is an overview of a very small snippet of the financial model. And I talk about an availability basis for the payments. What this is a representation of service payment deductions that would happen if there were a holding core that were unavailable. So each pair of courtrooms flank a central holding core. And if that holding core were unavailable, there would be about a $3,500 per day deduction from the service payments. If there were an elevator that those units stack through the building, so there are 5 floors. If you took the floors and stacked them up and had one of the elevators that serves the holding core be unavailable, then all of those holding cores and therefore all of those courtrooms would be unavailable. You get to about a $20,000 per day deduction. If you had a more serious instance, for example, say the security system were down, or they couldn't drive the buses into the sally port in the basement to offload people, you'd be talking about the entire facility being unavailable. The penalty there is about $250,000 a day. So the point is that there are significant financial implications of having a facility that must work, all of which are conditioned upon availability, and there are separate conditions relative to upkeep and maintenance that are built into the payment for the facility. Overall, the risks in the project that were transferred in that the org chart slide that I showed, there were a number of, there were the 2 entities at the bottom that I said absorbed most of the risk. Those fell into these categories. Development, so this included things like title administration, utilities, both arranging the facilities to the new building, but also rerouting networks of facilities around the 2 city block site. Design and construction risks, which you would logically think that the contractor would hold under a design build, but these were the normal things like code compliance, budget, and schedule, but I would give particular emphasis to quality. We always care about the product that we produce, but recall that this is a facility that must work or else there are service outages. So if you have to move into the facility to repair a punch list item or to conduct a repair on a piece of equipment or any of those types of things, it might mean that you need to shut down a jail cell or a courtroom or something to that effect, and that has a direct financial implication. So quality gets an even greater emphasis during the life of construction and design so that those things are considered. Completion risks. The investors for the project that I showed on that slide are counting on a return on their the money that they have put in the facility up front. And that money ultimately is supposed to come from the service payments that are made by the state. Well, if for some reason the contractor, the design builder, did not deliver the facility on time, those investors are still looking for a return on their investment. And effectively, those service payments end up being made by the contractor in the form of liquidated damages, far greater than we would be accustomed to seeing in the industry if the facility were not turned over on time. And the efficacy of that transition, the effectiveness of them being able to move into the facility and use it on day one was critical. If there were not the ability for them to move in and use it on day one, there would have been a big debate over who's responsible and what factors contributed. That, as I'll talk about a little bit later, had a significant influence over a number of the things that we did during the design and the construction process. Also, the life cycle costs. So operation and maintenance for 35 years based on availability and also upkeep, cleanliness, function, et cetera, were risks that were transferred. So all of these things were part of the delivery. So quick overview, just to recap a couple of the elements from the video. This was about 530,000 square feet, 31 courtrooms, space for 6 future expansion courtrooms. Notably, there were about 100,000 square feet of leasable space. Part of that was leased to the county agencies, so the sheriff, the public defender, alternate public defender, probation department, and also some retail leasing. Those were things that the state could not normally have done. They're prohibited from being a landlord, but given the private elements of the job, those things could be incorporated to help offset some of the state's costs for the facility. And occupancy date, August 30th of 2013, we actually beat that by a few days. Quick overview of the delivery. This was a 32-month project, 14 months of design, 26 months of construction with an 8-month lap. Very aggressive schedule. The design period I'll call particular attention to was most intense between April of 2011 at 50% design development documents and January, February of 2012 where we produced the 100% construction documents. Fast track process, packaging of the design set, site preparation, structure, envelope, and things like that. We did finish the project 11 days early. I don't know that we coined the term, but we became common users of the phrase coffee cup ready. So the facility needed to be coffee cup ready, the computers needed to be there and working, networks are all functioning, security badges programmed, boxes unloaded, those types of things. So the courts were in full session 9 days after we delivered the facility, which is something I think that we're particularly proud of and that speaks to the nuances of this type of delivery. The performance-based infrastructure process had a significant influence on the things that we needed to do as design builders. So this was a very crowded design process. We had far beyond the usual players involved. So we had an operating service provider who would be there for the next 35 years, clearly very interested in how the facility was designed and constructed. We also had the lenders at the table on nearly an everyday basis. We had a number of insurance providers who were insuring risks that were heretofore unknown in our industry, at least in the US. We had representatives from a variety of leased spaces. We had the project company, Long Beach Judicial Partners, that special purpose entity. We had users and jurisdictional agencies. We had an independent building expert, which was part of the procurement. And you know, I could go on, but I think the point is that all of those parties were contractually entitled to opinions. They weren't just there to kind of chime in and go back to their day jobs. These are all entities that had a stake financially in the outcome of the facility based on the delivery method. And so as the person who was serving as the project manager for the project, that was not for the faint of heart. It demanded that we put into place both a structure for receiving comments and responding to those comments and systems that accommodated all of that. If we took all of those entities and lined them up end to end in terms of review cycles, we'd still be working on design review. So it took a deliberate process that was organized into tiers. It took an online database with a continuous feedback loop, and also the willingness to break that process as necessary when fundamental topics arose so that we could change direction as necessary. I would say that on our average, just for sake of comparison, our average downtown Washington, D.C. office building, fairly straightforward product, we might have 1,500 requests for information just as a barometer, and you know, some more, some less, depending on the nature of the delivery method and other things. But if you equate those requests for information during the normal construction process to design review comments in the design build under PBI, that 1,500 might be over the course of, say, 20 months. We had 7,000 design review comments over the course of 8 months during the lap between design and construction. All of those had to be received, addressed, responded, approved by all of the entities, and incorporated into the design. And so when I say not for the faint of heart, that's what I'm speaking of. So we've talked some about the process. I think it's helpful to understand some examples of how this actually influenced the end product. So I've got a few examples here. These range from anecdotal to deeper major systems. So first, flooring. So this would be an example of life cycle factors. We have life cycle and replacement costs that are built into the delivery. And based on the performance standards, the carpet would need to be replaced every 5 years in order to be kind of the right level of wear and tear at the outside. And so if you're talking about a 35-year delivery, replacing every 5 years, you're going to replace that carpet 7 times over the life of the project, which includes 1 at the end because they have to receive the facility in great condition. You look at the first cost of carpet times 7 versus the cost of terrazzo, which is a nicer, more robust finish, the metrics of best value start to look very different. So we had more terrazzo than we might otherwise have if we were just looking at first cost under a traditional delivery. So my point here is that this PBI and 35-year term and obligated maintenance changed the game. It was still designed to budget, but it was, the budget was an envelope of 35 years. I'll give you another example, and this is more one of risk transfer and waterproofing systems for the project. You can imagine that Long Beach is close to the ocean. We have had variable water tables over time. So when we went back and looked at the geotechnical report, historical water table was anywhere from 12 to 25 feet below existing street grade. We consulted with some experts. I said some, not one, and whenever you consult with several experts, you get several opinions. And we ended up with conflicting opinions over what we should do with the waterproofing systems. And when we thought about what that would mean in the context of a 35-year delivery where there are leaky basement risks and what does it mean to need to go into the basement and displace all of the people who would be in the holding cells, and what does that mean relative to service payment deductions, it informed our thought processes a little bit differently than might have been the case under a first cost, first delivery basis. And so we ended up with more robust waterproofing systems at no additional cost to the owner. That was part of the risk that had been taken by the consortium and, in fact, in this case, by the design builder. The next example I'll give you is our light fixtures for the project. Well, we're probably all familiar at this point with the fact that LED fixtures can be much more energy efficient. They also come at a cost premium. Today, even if the manufacturers tell us otherwise, the pricing suggests that there is still a cost premium in general for LED fixtures. A lesser known fact may be that they last many multiples of times longer than the lamps last many multiples of time longer than compact fluorescent or incandescent. When we did a net present value analysis on what does it cost to put scaffolding on top of the escalators in order to be able to change out the lamps in these fixtures, or to put scaffolding at the front entrance to get to the decorative fixture around the trim of the cornice, and looked at that alongside the cost premium of those fixtures, it was a much easier decision to go with the premium fixtures. And this was an example where there was a monetary exchange on the basis of positive net present value within the project team without needing to have any conversation with the owner. In this case, the operating service provider, Johnson Controls, and Clark exchanged about $120,000 to upgrade fixtures. It's really quite rewarding as the design builder to be able to make decisions like this and do the right thing, and not kind of have our feet to the coals on well, we should do it. We can make a right decision based on sound financial thinking in support of the owner's needs. The last example that I'll give you is the mechanical systems for the project, and this is kind of the most dramatic example, also the earliest incorporated. And it really focuses on the architecture of the systems to emphasize the concepts of isolation and of redundancy. So what we're looking at here is an isometric cutaway of the mechanical systems for the project. Each of these clusters of equipment is one of the rooftop penthouses. There are 6 of those. And with the penthouses, even if you were to have a catastrophe, these are able to operate more or less independently. So if you lose one of those penthouses, there's some type of an incident in there, you're only losing a fraction of the building. So this notion of isolation is if you keep 5/6 of the building operational while you work on repairing the catastrophe in the one, you're still in much better shape than if the whole building went down. Within each of those penthouses, we had the concepts of redundancy. And so in the upper right, these 3 boxes in the diagram are each an air handling unit. And those air handling units have variable frequency drives, and they're headered together at the top. On any given day, they're able to operate, under their normal function, they operate independently, and that header is separated. But if there's a need for either routine or unexpected maintenance to any one of those air handling units, the system can be headed together, and the two remaining air handling units with the variable frequency drives ramped up are able to serve the needs of the remaining building on, say, 98% of the days, given the climate of Long Beach. And so it was designed, the whole system was designed around uptime. The punchline here on all of these examples is that there were significant decisions that occurred throughout the design process that respond to the notion of infrastructure that has to remain operational. And again, I thought that was quite rewarding, though challenging. So the design, build, finance, operate, and maintain process, given this delivery method, it caused great changes to stakeholder entitlement, to design review, to construction coordination, commissioning and training, occupancy process. I'm going to focus for a moment here on kind of summarizing the last three of these. The depth of the field and executive level coordination with the operator were far beyond anything I've seen on any project previously. We had weekly meetings with the operator throughout the life of the construction, interacting with them about what their needs would be when the facility was turned over. The commissioning and training process, we're always going to value the contract specifications, but in this case, the contract specifications became very much less the point of discussion, and really the point of discussion was, what do we need to do to make sure that when the facility is occupied and when the operators are here, they know exactly what they need to do. So whether it's prescribed by the contract specifications or not, it was the outcome that mattered as opposed to the black and white of the specs. The specs were table stakes. The outcome really became the focus, and that was, again, exciting. On the last of these points, the occupancy process, there was a tremendous emphasis on occupancy timeliness and the cleanliness of transition. We went so far as to hire a move coordinator to make sure that all of the boxes that started in one person's office in the old court facility moved to that same person's office in the new facility, such that we could be sure that they were really ready to operate on day one. I think all of those things speak to the notion of incentive alignment around efficacy and around being able to move into a facility that works, both the product that was delivered and the process by which it was delivered. So this is a picture of the completed facility from 2013, and as I've stood here for the last 27 minutes and kind of talked to you about it, you can, I'm sure, detect a sense of pride in what it is and what it will continue to be. But despite that positive bias, I think it's important to note that not everybody shared that perspective during the life of the project. And whenever you're doing something new and different, you might expect that people will question that. So this is another part of the project management process. Another part of our design, build, finance, operate, maintain experience was expecting scrutiny from the outside, from disenfranchised parties or watchdog agencies. In this case, a significant share of that came from an entity in California whose charge it is to question the use of the taxpayers' dollars, and I think that's a good cause. This was the Legislative Analyst's Office, and the LAO gave particular focus to the original Ernst & Young value for money analysis. And the value for money analysis really looks at the whole equation of not just design build, but the finance operate and maintain piece, and noted a $160 million chunk of money that was essentially a long-term cost. The LAO focused on that $160 million as the project being over budget. There were some of their reports that conveyed the $160 million as when you compare delivering a courthouse the old way versus the new way, it costs $160 million more. Well, the difference there is the old way only looks at first cost. The new way looks at the whole thing. So that was, it took some doing to have all of those conversations and try and explain people the differences. In fact, the construction costs were fixed at the beginning of our contract. We delivered $10 million back to the state at the end. So we were not $160 million over budget. But that was part of operating in this world. All of that, the 160 and the value for money analysis really boils down to risk and the cost of that risk. Some of the best perspective, no matter what I stand here or say or anybody else will say relative to this delivery method, some of the best perspective will come over time. We'll see how the facility performs. We'll see what the costs are. And one of the stipulations of the LAO's report was that there be a comparison conducted between the Long Beach Courthouse, and other similar projects. The most similar project is actually a court that was delivered at roughly the same time, the San Bernardino Courthouse in Southern California, close by geographically. And so there's an ongoing comparison process between these two projects that will play out over a number of years relative to cost and value, to schedule, to product, performance, and to future needs. And the first of those points, cost and value, the initial report has been conducted now. The cost per square foot was effectively the same on a first cost basis of the construction cost. There was about 0.1% difference. Who would have guessed that it could be so close? The value for that cost under the Long Beach job was deemed to be greater based on future expansion capacity, based on greater holding capacity, more holding cells to accommodate the future courtrooms. They have those holding cells now, and also based on the MEP system design. Relative to schedule, the second of those points, the Long Beach project was delivered about 2 years faster than would have been the case under the traditional process. State of California typically delivers their projects through CM at risk. And in this case, the design-build element of PBI enabled a fast-track process overlapping design and construction. The state also didn't have to wait for the sale of bonds, which they typically would have had to do under a normal delivery method. The third of those points, product, so material selections. There were higher first cost products incorporated into this project than there would have otherwise been, better selections in the interest of long-term performance. Relative to performance, really too early to draw any final conclusions as to how the facility will perform over the 35 years. But what you might expect is something like this slide. If you imagine that first video that I showed you being the blue line with jagged, you have a deterioration cycle, a crisis, an investment to repair the crisis, and then continued deterioration based on the robbing of the coffers, versus what we might expect with the Long Beach project is more like the green curve, where you have a continuous investment and managed process to look after the project. The fifth of those future needs, I talked some about expansion space. Let me show you what that looked like. There were blocks within the courtroom. The gray bar in the middle of the bottom right is the central core for detention, flanked by a courtroom on either side. Essentially, those blocks were made with all of the infrastructure in, the elevators, the stairs, the mechanical systems designed to accommodate that being incorporated into the future, where other county agencies were inserted temporarily during the life of the job, or during the first 15 years. The state has the right, but not the obligation, to move into those spaces at set intervals, the first of which is at 15 years. So overall, the value for money assumptions so far have proven valid. The site cost and transfer, the timing, the capital costs, all were in line with assumptions. In fact, there was a successful post-construction refinance of the facility, suggesting that the market sees this type of project as a good investment. There were no design and construction costs passed on to the AOC beyond those in the agreement. It's, as I said, too early to gauge whether the operating costs will be in line or out of line, but what we've seen in the first 18 months or so of post-construction, post-design build period is that there have been a total of about $10,000 to $15,000 in service payment deductions. It's a pretty small number in the context of that framework I described to you earlier on what could happen, the way that those could accrue. So early results would suggest that we did a good job. So I'm at about 34 minutes here. I think this is a 45-minute segment. I'd love to take questions if you have them. I would summarize on my end by saying it truly was an exciting project. Happy to have the opportunity to share. I think this type of delivery is quite likely to enable things that would not otherwise be customary, and I think it helps those of us in the design and construction industry to be better design builders and deliver better projects over time. So with that, I'll take questions. I see one in the back. I missed the first part of your question, but I think it was, what is California's take? Do they want to do it again? Yeah, we're pursuing probably a half dozen of these projects across the country right now. And so we're certainly interested under the right circumstances to do it again. I think there have been some pretty significant continuing shifts relative to what types of risks are trying to be transferred, and there are a lot of people who watched Long Beach unfold and said, wow, we should do that, and yet they're kind of not incorporating everything exactly that way. There's more being shoved into the bag. And so the pursuit costs are quite high. The risks are hard to define in the earliest stages of the pursuit when you have to put a team like this together. And it can be a risky proposition. So if we could do this over again, we'd love to. But different jurisdictions are doing it a little bit differently, and we find out as they develop their solicitations whether it's going to be attractive or not. Yes?
Did the two other contractors you competed against get reimbursed for their pursuit efforts or not?
There was a stipend on the project. The way it was structured was kind of creative. The winner had to, all proposers had to carry $1 million in their proposal to reimburse $500,000 to each of the non-winners from the final three. And so each of the non-winners received a $500,000 stipend. You know, that sounds creative and nice. The reality is that the cuteness of it goes away if the state entity or the government entity is unable to bring the solicitation to fruition and no one wins. So it's possible that everybody could invest significant money and effort and then no one gets anything. In this case, each of the losers, non-winners, did get a $500,000 stipend. Yes? It's a great question. We had, I think your question was picked up by the mic, but in case it wasn't, the question was how do we resolve differences of opinion between the stakeholders during the life of the design process. The operating service provider and the project company and the design builder had an executive committee that I sat on and that lead representative from each of the other entities sat on, and we would sit down and evaluate those things. And most of it came down to net present value. So, you know, we were able to resolve all of our differences in that way. Some took longer than others. We had an interesting discussion of which type of seating was better in the courtrooms. Was it bench seating or was it individual audience-style seating? And it came into discussions of, you know, you could replace one versus an entire bench. Well, the cost of replacing one, if it's damaged, is much lower, but the durability of the benches is higher. So we had some interesting discussions that I think, again, inform the types of thought processes that can yield better buildings in the long run. Yes?
On one of your slides, you had displayed some kind of, some numbers for non-performance. So I was like thinking, how did you guys come up with those numbers? Were they your numbers or they were proposed by the court?
Great question. I'm sorry I didn't mention that actually. So the Administrative Office of the Courts stipulated the framework. So they said these are the units for the project. So it'll be a courtroom or a holding cell or, you know, the modules. They prescribed the modules and each of the proposing teams filled in the cost associated with that. Now, all of that was subject to the final deal terms. I've got a question in the back and then one up here. The City of Long Beach had at the time a redevelopment agency. That redevelopment agency is now disbanded. But the redevelopment agency negotiated a swap for the existing courthouse site on Ocean Boulevard for a larger site where the new courthouse was built several blocks further away from kind of the hub of downtown. So there was a land swap, and there were a few $1 million. I think it was 7 total, but really it was a land swap for the existing courthouse, which is now part of a follow-on to the earlier question. It's part of a follow-on performance-based infrastructure delivery for the City of Long Beach and the Port of Long Beach, which we're constructing through a similar delivery method. There was a question here.
I know that sometimes on design-build projects, getting the contractor and the AE firm to see eye to eye, especially if there's a push in schedule. I was just wondering how that relationship was in this project, and additionally, if AECOM shouldered any of the risk in terms of not meeting the deliverable deadline.
Good question, and I think every team would tackle this a little bit differently. Without getting into kind of secret sauce, I would say that the pressure was amplified relative to delivery of documents timely because of the significantly higher liquidated damages on the job, and that did create the needs to press each other along the way. The transfer of risk between the contractor and the designer really fell along traditional terms in terms of errors and omissions and professional liability, which effectively, given the amplified risk on the project, meant that the design builder, that Clark took a larger share of risk than we would otherwise have taken. I think we're at 42 minutes now. Who else has questions? All right. Well, we'll be respectful of your time and say thank you very much. It was a pleasure to speak with you.